Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session on arguably the most important topic in the world today, will democracy survive? My name is Robin Wright. I am a joint fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm a columnist for The New Yorker. I'm delighted to moderate this panel with three of the finest minds in not just America, but in the world on foreign policy. Three people who are truly globalists in the 21st century, and I have to say that's a very rare commodity. I could spend the rest of the session just reading off their credentials, but briefly, Anne-Marie Slaughter is the CEO of New America, a think tank that is dedicated to renewing the promise of America. She was the first female director of policy planning at the State Department. During the Obama administration, she was a professor at Princeton and has written or edited 8 books. They include The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World, and A New World Order. She is a regular on Fareed Zakaria's GPS. Moises Naim has one of the greatest life stories, and I love introducing him because he is a, get this, Libyan-born Jew, think about that, who was brought up in Venezuela, became Minister of Industry and Finance, then director of its central bank. He went on to be an executive director at the World Bank, and he is now a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He gained recognition as the editor of Foreign Policy magazine. His books include The End of Power, which is an exploration of how power is changing across all societies, and his new book, The Revenge of Power, how autocrats are reinventing politics for the 21st century. And Yascha Mounk is an academic and author known for his work on democracy and the crisis of liberal values. He was born in Germany to Polish parents, educated in Britain and at Harvard in the United States. He now teaches at Johns Hopkins University. He's a contributing editor at The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author of 4 books, including The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. And I have to say both Yascha and Moises' books are on the Financial Times best books of the year. So congratulations to both of you. We have this conversation about democracy at a time that only 20% of the world's people live in democracies today. There has been a consistent decline in democracies over the past 16 years, according to Freedom House. 3 billion people now live in countries that are not free. So let me begin with Yascha. Most of us have had the privilege of growing up in democracies, and we take advantage, or take for granted the idea. But in your new book, you warn that the citizenry of not just the United States, but of democracies around the world have become restless and disillusioned with democracy. Why? And what's the danger for democracy?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Thanks for the generous introduction. It's amazing when you look at the relative stability of affluent, established democracies for many, many decades until quite recently. And then over the last 10 years or so, you've seen not just the decline of democracy in many parts of the world where there were fledgling new countries that were poorer, where political scientists might have expected that they could go into trouble, but in the United States, in many European countries, even in countries like Brazil or India, which had been democratic for a good number of decades at this point, where we're really having hopes that we could take the future stability of those democratic systems for granted. So it's really hard to have one set of explanations for all of those different cases, but clearly something important has changed. And I think 3 things are fundamental. One is the rise of the internet and of social media, which has made it much easier for extremists to enter our politics, which fractures the political discourse, which makes it much easier to vilify each other and to punish anybody who tries to say, well, perhaps you can see a little bit of wisdom in different parts of the political spectrum. So that's one fundamental development. The other, especially in the most established democracies, those that have historically been most affluent, is a stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens, right? So for much of the period of democratic stability, the vast majority of citizens could say, I'm a lot more affluent than my parents were. I'm very hopeful that my kids are going to be more affluent than me. And so even if sometimes I don't like what politicians in Washington, D.C. or Bonn in the past or Rome are up to, even though I think they're a little corrupt and there's all kinds of things wrong with them, something seems to be working, so let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Now we've had a real stagnation of living standards for a long time. In the United States, from 1935 to 1960, the living standard of average Americans doubled. From 1960 to 1985, the living standard of average Americans doubled again. Since 1985, it has been more or less stagnant. There's debates among economists about just how stagnant it's been, but definitely it hasn't been increasing as it has in the past. The third reason, which is really the subject of my latest book, The Great Experiment, has to do with demographic change. So historically, democracies have either been pretty homogeneous, as the country I grew up in, Germany, was at the moment of its founding after World War II, because of the crimes and the wars of the first half of the 20th century. Germany, by 1948, was a pretty ethnically and religiously homogeneous country, and it was founded on that homogeneity in certain ways. It made it easier. I don't think it's a coincidence, but that's when German democracy took hold. And then, of course, there's democracies like the United States that have always been diverse societies. America has always had people from many different demographic groups within itself, from Native Americans to African Americans who were brought here in chains to lots of other groups. But the democracy in the United States used to be quite homogeneous because most groups were excluded from power, some in the most extreme ways, up to and including chattel slavery. And what we're trying to do now is actually to build these ethnically and religiously diverse democracies, but at least attempt to treat all of the members as equals. And that's a really difficult new challenge, and we don't quite have the answers as to how to do that. So those, I think, are the three large-scale reasons why we're seeing this moment of deep democratic turbulence right now.
Thanks. So to Anne-Marie next. In an email exchange we had last week, you wrote me that the rot in U.S. democracy is deep. And you identified three big failures. What do you think? How do you define, and how deep is the rot?
So thank you, Robin. I'm going to, before I answer your question, I just want to remind people that in the 1990s, when there was huge excitement, end of history, democracy everywhere, Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Third Wave, right? And he did say, through history, there's this surge forward of democracy, and then some ebb back. So I think part of what we need to be the question we need to be asking is this more than the usual surge forward and ebb back? Because I've thought about that quite a bit. And I agree very much with Yasha's analysis, particularly the last one, the point about demography, which we can talk about later. But I think even before you get to those macro issues, and they're hugely important, and certainly the standard of living one is key, they're more micro issues. And when I was talking about the rot in American democracy, I'll start by invoking Madeleine Albright. This is the first Aspen summer without Madeleine Albright. But one of the things that I used to quote her saying all the time was, democracy has to deliver. And she was passionate, a champion of democracy, but her point was it can't just be votes, it has to deliver. And in the United States, so often, even when we can pass policies, which is very hard, but even when we pass them, they do not deliver. I'll just give you two examples, and New America does a lot of work with state bureaucracies, local bureaucracies. New Jersey has paid family leave. Many of us think, really want paid family leave. We want paid family leave at the federal level. New Jersey has it. 40% take it. Why? Well, good luck with the forms in the first place. New Jersey's forms don't take names that are 2 letters long, because Smith has more than 2 letters. But Lee, on the other hand, just one example, there are 2 different programs. Employers don't want you to find out about paid family leave because they've got to pay. There are a whole litany of these kinds of very granular problems that mean somebody sees this as passed, paid family leave, they don't get it. Another quick example, Minnesota, really great state in many ways, 9 agencies deal with families under 5. Can you imagine being, you know, a single mother or any kind of parent trying to navigate 9 different agencies? So at the very granular level, democracy doesn't deliver. And then second, even when it does, for far too many Americans, their interaction with government is one of disrespect or even degradation, where, you know, look, I'm a white, affluent woman. When I go and deal with government bureaucracy, it may be slow, but it's rarely insulting. That is not true for many, many, many millions of Americans who really feel disrespected by their own government in a way that certainly weakens the idea that government matters and I should vote for it and I should turn out and I should care. And the third piece is, it flows from the second, but it's even worse. For large communities, communities of color, and we saw this with Michael Brown's murder back in Ferguson, the government's actually predatory. You know, anybody who gets parking tickets and doesn't pay them right away, just watch what happens, right? The fines go up very, very fast. Very soon then your registration is gone, then you can't drive, then the fines keep doubling. That, in a way, is not that different than lots of developing countries where you just ask for graft. It's institutionalized rather than just asking for a bribe at a checkpoint. But for many Americans, the government is not only not responsive, but is actually predatory in the sense of making municipal budgets off the back of lots of people, often the people who can least afford to pay. So when I said the rot is deep, I absolutely agree with what Yasha said, but I think there's a much more granular set of issues that most of us don't have to deal with.
Thanks. So Moises, you and I also had an email exchange over the week, and you wrote me, there's an all-out global insider-driven attack against the checks and balances that define a democracy. That these attacks are often stealthy and designed to make autocracies look like democracies. So the interesting thing was you noted that the number of people around the world living in democracies is dwindling, but the number of elections is soaring. So explain the contradiction, and I'm just curious, who are these insiders?
Yes, there is this surprising number of elections around the world for a lot of things, for head of state and president, but also at the local level. As we speak now, I bet you that there is an election going on somewhere in the world. Why? And why is this happening at the same time that the democracies are in retreat? There is a problem with democracy. Well, because a lot of these elections are sham elections. And a lot of these elections are manipulated and stealthily driven to generate some specific results. But yet, leaders continue to push for those, even though everybody thinks and knows that there is, you know, these are adulterated, distorted, interfered, not free elections, free and fair. Well, because they bestow an element of a modicum of legitimacy. This is a political, in the political arena, this is one of the most important dimensions, and there's a deep shortage of identities, and those identities are associated, of course, with legitimacy. And so elections, even if they're trick elections, bestow some element of legitimacy that allows government to continue and you know, autocratic regimes to continue.
So, Yasha, the New Yorker has a new piece this week with a scary title. Does Hungary give us a glimpse of America's authoritarian future? Viktor Orban, of course, a populist, was democratically elected. Do you see similarities, and does it give us a glimpse of our own future?
I mean, there's many deep and structural differences between Hungary and the United States. Hungary is a small and relatively homogeneous country that has a relatively short democratic history. The United States is a much more diverse country, a much more federal country that has a much longer democratic history. And so it would be very easy to say that there aren't really any similarities or overlaps. But I do think that the fundamental challenge to our democracies at this point comes in a similar form. Viktor Orban and Donald Trump are very different in character and very different in many of the values and beliefs, but they do share an attribute along with Hugo Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, along with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, along with Recep Erdogan in Turkey, of being what I call authoritarian populists. Now, populist is a term that is thrown around a lot in our politics, and so it's often misapplied, it's often used very, very sloppily, but the way that political scientists think about the term, it is defined in a relatively straightforward way. It is somebody who says that they and they alone truly represent the people, and that anybody who disagrees with them is by virtue of that fact illegitimate. There's two great expressions of that. One is from Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who now has a bigger role in French politics as of elections a few weeks ago, who once in a heated exchange said, "La République, c'est moi." I am the Republic. The other is the Twitter handle of Evo Morales, which is 11 characters. Evo es pueblo. Evo is the people. And what does that imply? It implies that anybody who disagrees with you is illegitimate. And so once you win elections, as Viktor Orban did in a legitimate way, as Donald Trump did in a legitimate way, they say nobody can constrain the extent of my power. If some independent institution wants to do something else, if Congress doesn't go along with my wishes, if the media criticize me, that is illegitimate because they are attacking the people itself. And so we see this real danger that it becomes impossible at some point to remove a democratically elected government by democratic means. That is the fundamental problem in Hungary, where Viktor Orban now controls the media very strongly, has his loyalists in the Electoral Commission, his loyalists in the court, and that is what Donald Trump, in a much more concerted way than in 2016, will try to do if he wins power in 2024, as he very well might.
Wow. So, Anne-Marie, the challenges to democracy today have ugly undertones, that have as much to do with social identity and race and ethnicity as political ideas. There's this basic conflict between individualism and public solidarity. So in our email exchange, you made a very interesting and to me frightening observation. You said white Anglo-Saxon culture has less solidarity than African American culture or Asian American culture or Indigenous American culture or Hispanic American culture. Why is that, given that democracy has its roots in European ideas? And how has the changing nature of society in this country or elsewhere impacted the state and the prospects of democracy?
So here I do want to build on Yasha's third point, because I just think it's impossible to overstate the importance of the demographic change in the United States. In 2026, it will be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So in 1976, I was 18. I manned a bicentennial booth in Charlottesville, Virginia. You can imagine what that was like. Mr. Jefferson appeared around every corner. It was the tall ships. It was complete celebration. But at that point, the United States was still 75, 80% white. By 2027, Americans under 30 will not have a white majority. That is already true today of Americans under 18. And by somewhere between 2040 and 2045, depending how long the baby boomers live, we will not have a white majority. That is just a huge change, right? For most of our history, and if you're thinking the European American history, obviously it's not true for indigenous Americans, there has been an overwhelming white majority. And suddenly now, for the next 250 years, if we make it that long, we are what I would call a plurality nation. Now, I embrace that vision of this country. I think it's our greatest strength. I think we'll be a country that will reflect the world, can connect the world. The vibrance of that collision of cultures is extraordinary. But, as Yasha says, you cannot have that kind of change without a tremendous amount of social turbulence. Europe, some European countries will follow us. Britain is supposed to get to the same place by the 2070s. So just to start, it should not surprise any of us that you have the situation that populists can take advantage of and blame others of different races, ethnicities, everything else. But there's an additional dimension, which Robin asked about, that I do think in a time where you have diversity and democracy is fraying, if you're in France or in Italy, you can tap a tradition of social solidarity that is weakened by the heterogeneity, but at least is there. And, we are a deeply individualist country. We do not have a deep appeal to solidarity. But what you see as we change, as we become the new America, as we become, I think, a country that delivers on the promise of our ideals, we are also seeing pockets of our new culture that have far more solidarity. I mean, in part, these are poorer cultures. I mean, African-American culture, certainly if you look at 19th century, 20th century, there's cultures where people help one another. There are different religions, right? So the Catholic religion has a greater tradition of solidarity. You look at Hispanic Americans. And then Asian Americans have tremendous sort of emphasis on family. I'm generalizing and stereotyping enormously, I realize that. But as we think about what we need, and I would refer you to both Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, where she talks about solidarity dividends, and Ted Johnson's book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America, and he talks about an American tradition of solidarity that will help us move forward. But to my point, that tradition clashes with a very strong, highly individualist tradition that, yes, supported democracy in Britain, but Britain's very unusual. That the Anglo-Saxon history is quite unusual. In continental Europe, it taps much more often a sort of deeper solidaristic tradition.
Great. So, Moises, you coined a term, political necrophilia. And I read that and I went,
good term.
Yick. But it's a very interesting idea. You describe it as a perversion that makes people obsessively attracted to cadavers. In politics, that means the irresistible attraction to bad ideas and bad policies that never work. Explain.
It's straightforward. I'm always perplexed as the endurance and the permanence of very bad ideas, policy ideas that have been tried and tested in the same country at different times, in different countries at different times, and they always end in tears, more corruption, more, I'm talking about economic policy, social policies, the sort of things we were discussing, the granular things. Bad ideas, and bad ideas reign, and we know that, and they keep coming back. And they come back because they nurture hope, because they feel comfortable, and it has a lot to do with the sort of things that Anne-Marie and Yasha were talking. And that is the underperformance of democracies and other countries. Part of what they said sounded like it is the United States, but no, it's global. A lot of these trends are global in nature, and it's very important to understand that it's not the only democracies that are underperforming. It's countries that are underperforming. The difference is that in autocratic, dictatorial countries, you don't have surveys, you don't have, you don't have the media to scrutinize and denounce your underperformance. There you have repression of any statement or any denunciation of underperformance. So that's that. So again, these are ways of garnering support in moments where it is very hard to govern, and it's very hard to be successful at governing. And that is where there is another set of trends that are global in nature, but are very important because they drive what's happening to democracy in the world, and I call them the 3 Ps: populism, polarization, and post-truth. Populism, Yasha already described it. The essence of populism is divide and conquer. I am you, but there is a cabal, a group, an elite that is predatory, that is horrible, and that abuses the noble people. And I, the Messiah, the leader, will solve that for you. And that is Then there is polarization, and polarization is like cholesterol. There's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Polarization also there is good polarization, and that's called democracy. You have different groups, and you affiliate with different groups, and they compete for your support in the electoral arena. That's democracy. We want that. But there is also bad polarization, toxic polarization, where you don't tolerate the fact that others that don't think like you exist politically. You deny them the right to be part of the political options. And all of that, of course, is fueled and energized and amplified by this post-truth, the fact that the sowing of discord and confusion is, the practitioners of post-truth don't necessarily want to change the way you think. They want you to have doubts about what you think. And it is in that moment, in that cauldron of confusion, that the opportunities for populism and polarization grow and democracies are undermined.
So I want to leave some time to open up to questions, but I'm going to do a quick round. And I'm going to throw out a number of ideas, and feel free to address any of the ones you're interested in. But we get to this issue of identity so often, and all 4 of us are globalists. We've traveled the world, and we think we can we get the bigger picture, right? And yet, I went to the University of Michigan, and no offense, but Ohio State is like, and so I know I've got identity problems or issues as well, and I think we all do. So, I'm kind of struck as listening to all of you. So I'm interested in, where are we headed, and why is it that there are no charismatic Democrats to lead us? It seems like there are all these authoritarian or charismatic autocrats, without getting into politics or whatever. And frankly, the one thing I don't do is cover American politics. And what's the best case scenario and the worst case scenario? So let's do a lightning round, and Anne-Marie, you start.
All right, I'm going to give you a little bit of case for optimism, because I think we need it desperately. My colleague Lee Drutman, who is a wonderful political scientist and really has pioneered, how do we get out of what he calls the toxic doom loop of 2 parties that have nothing in common anymore and cannot compromise. And he really says that at the moment of the worst crisis, right? We all suffer from sort of projecting where we are, but it is the kind of, it's darkest before the dawn, but more importantly, in a dynamic way. And he's written a paper with the Niskanen Center that I recommend. In a dynamic way, it's precisely when we're very aware of the crisis, which I think we've been in crisis for some time. We are unquestionably aware of it. That's when you start to be able to really mobilize forces for big change. So again, in our political system, we essentially need to move to proportional representation. We need to have I mean, just think about it. The 2 parties do not represent the diversity of views in the country. We can move to that without constitutional changes. You just have to change federal legislation, and in many states you don't have to do that. And what he would say is, as the polarization gets worse and worse, the gridlock gets worse and worse, the politicization of the courts and our other institutions gets worse and worse, what you are seeing are people recognizing that we need fundamental electoral change or political structural change. And you are getting that increasingly on the ground in states across the country and actually even in Congress. He said he just presented this and he expected, you know, because these are Democrats and Republicans, to be kicked out of the room. And instead he got, how do we make this change from a fair number of people? So I'll give you a bit of hope, but we do have to change our political system. Not democracy, but how we actually exercise our democracy.
Great. Moises?
So why is the world not more alarmed at what's happening to democracies? The numbers are staggering. You know, in the last decade, a lot of changes took place in the world, but one of the changes that has not been sufficiently discussed is this retreat of democracy, and democracies are embattled and in difficulty. Well, but there's no notable reaction to that. And one of the reasons is that weakening of democracy has taken place in a very stealthy way. These leaders, these autocratic leaders, are very stealthy in the way they do it. It's no longer a coup d'etat used to be an event and a specific moment and time and place with the military being the main protagonist. That is no longer the case. Now what we see is backsliding of democracies, checks and balances that are weakened, diluted, neutralized. And all is done in ways that are not obvious to the naked eye. You need, you know, you continue with your lives, but there is a lot of bad things happening to democracy around the world. So what to do? Well, no problem has ever been solved if before it was not identified. And this problem has not been sufficiently identified because of the stealthiness with which democracies are being undermined. So the first alarm is to make people aware. In order to change the political system, first you need to have people alarmed, energized, motivated to understand that there is a need for an intervention there. So that's hopeful. In terms of the first step, which is the most difficult one, which is to recognize that we have an emergency, a democratic emergency that needs attention, that needs priority, that cannot be, things managing politics as usual. We're no longer in the world of politics as usual. If Donald Trump wins the election and becomes a president again, we are going to have a different conversation of the nature of democracy in the United States. So it's not that you are picking between candidates. You're picking, you may have the option of picking a candidate that is going to undermine democracy in the same way that autocrats around the world are doing it. So the main priority is to be aware that politics as usual doesn't work and is in fact dangerous, and that you need to recognize that democratic activism and finding ways to change things for the better is indispensable.
I think the key word there is erosion. And since it's so gradual, it takes a crisis to kind of respond. I've often said the world's not going to be united until the aliens invade us. Yeah, sure.
They already have.
Well, so speaking of identity, and it's only if what's the way to unite the world? Well, we can all feel we have something in common compared to the sort of green marsmen, right? So that's the only hope. But I was thinking about your football rivalries because it's a really interesting point. So I teach at Johns Hopkins, and it's an incredibly diverse campus. In the freshman year, we only have about 20% of students who are counted as white. And my students think of themselves as some of the most tolerant people in the world, and in some ways, perhaps they are. But when I ask them whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich, and have them debate that question for a few minutes, and have them play a game against each other, those who think that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against those who think that a hot dog is not a sandwich. So
it's clearly not a sandwich.
There you are, very strong opinions. So we have this incredibly strong ability to form groups, to treat those who are members of the group very, very positively, and often to discriminate in extreme ways against those who are not members of it. That's a huge problem. The second huge problem is that we know from history that most of the time this is not about a football rivalry. It's not about the deluded people who think that a hot dog is a sandwich. It is about ascriptive identities, about ethnicity and religion and sometimes culture and language and nationality. And those pose particularly big risks. And so that's what makes it so hard for societies that, I agree with Anne-Marie, are becoming much more diverse to actually find the new rules that keep them together. Some of them are silly. Some of them are, you know what, we now have people in this country whose last names have 2 letters, and our forms better reflect that. Some of them are more complicated and more challenging than that. Those are transformations that we need to embrace. But just in the interest of having some disagreement on a panel, I think the one piece I disagreed on with Anne-Marie is to take for granted this description of our country that comes from the United States Census Bureau and has become really mainstream in our politics, but we're going to be majority-minority by something like 2045. Because that assumes that there's two obvious blocks of our society, that there's white people who are a coherent category, and then all of these other groups that somehow add up to a somewhat coherent non-white category. Now, if you take the definition of the United States Census Bureau for granted, if you say that anybody who has a drop of non-white blood or anybody who has spent some time in Latin America is therefore a person of color, and that actually helps us understand the sociological reality of a country, then that is true. But I think it's our task to make sure that that's not the case. It's our task politically that I'm not going to be able to look in the audience and know who you're voting for based on the color of your skin. It's our task to build a society in which the fundamental dividing lines, we'll always have dividing lines in a democracy, aren't along the lines of what ethnicity are you, what are your ancestors, do you have 1 out of 4 ancestors who are Asian, 1 out of 4 ancestors who are Hispanic, and so on. And I think actually when you look at reality today, there's obvious disadvantages and discrimination against many people who are visibly non-white, but the society is more complicated than that. It's not obvious to me, for example, that somebody who might have European royal ancestry on one side and Indian Brahmin ancestry on the other side, and who is the child of professionals going to a fancy private school, naturally falls into the same category as somebody whose ancestors were enslaved for many centuries. And so we need to challenge this depiction of today's reality, and we need to fight for a culture and for institutions and for a country in which that description becomes less true. Because if it becomes true by 2045, that the most salient description of a country is, we're now majority-minority and these two blocks oppose each other, that's going to be a really, really dark country to live in.
So we could have this conversation, but I want to open it up to the audience because we're really running low on time. I just want to make one clarification. When I talked about why don't we have charismatic Democrats, I was talking not about Democrats, capital D, I was talking about Democrats, lowercase d. So I want to open up to questions. We're being streamed online, and we already have a huge list of questions. So let me take 2 questions. There was one there, and we want a female to ask a question too. So, and then the second one here.
So the famous French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville talked about the nature of American democracy as one of being transparent, and also made reference to equality of conditions. Since the passage of Citizen United early 2000, clearly American democracy has lost significantly part of its transparent political process.
But we need a question.
And so the question is this: how can we even improve democracy if we have no transparency in our system and where the money is going?
Okay, and let's get a second question down here. And then we'll have a third one over here after we get answers to the first 2. Yeah, here.
Henrik Jones, predictions for 2025. What do you think about democracy? What might we be in? Does democracy, is there an arc to democracy where it actually takes a natural end and that there is a resolution, an evolution, as opposed to erosion?
Yeah, so when you say 2025, do you mean after our 2024?
Yeah. January 6, 2025, for example.
Okay, boy. Let's do it fast. Anne Marie?
Okay, so dark money in politics is exactly part of the structural reform that we need, but we can't get there until we can elect different people, because both parties are benefiting. Certain number of people are benefiting. I now think there is, somewhere between a 10 and a 20% chance that we certainly will have political violence. In the late 1960s, we had 300 bombings a year. They were from the left. Now they could be from wherever. But I'm not going to go so far as civil war, but real political violence, I think, is a real possibility. And the last thing I just have to say is I agree with you. I don't like majority-minority. I call us a plurality nation. Which I think is a much more positive vision.
Okay, so the third question was here, and it's very hard to see. We have another hand. Somebody can help me.
So my question is, what happens when one party thinks we're in crisis and the other party doesn't because they're achieving their goals? What happens then?
Yeah, good question. And the fourth one is here.
So a question that needs to be asked specifically in Aspen, what's the contribution of the wealth gap? Meaning most Americans are not benefiting and their quality of life is remain the same, but a lot of the people in the room actually benefit from the current situation. So how does it contribute?
Who wants to take either one?
I want to speak to, I think there's a bunch of questions that overlap a little bit. What's the immediate future of American democracy? What's it going to look like in 2025? I think there's three basic scenarios. One is that a candidate who believes in the basic institutions of American democracy wins. That could be a Democrat, whether it's Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or somebody else. It could, though it seems very unlikely, be a moderate Republican. That is the positive scenario. It does not look very likely at the moment. The second scenario, which is very concerning, is that we get a genuine constitutional crisis in 2024 because of the attempts of the Republican Party to politicize the process by which states decide who to send to the Electoral College. And we might, in the best case of that, we'll get significant political violence and huge turmoil, but the legitimate winner of the election gets seated. In the worst case scenario of that, we get such confusion about who actually is the legitimate commander-in-chief, or we end up with a real split in allegiance of the military or allegiance of not just private citizens, but people with official weapons. That is a worst-case scenario that is unlikely, but it is one that is worth pondering. And the third scenario, which is also very worrying, is that Donald Trump or another authoritarian populist wins the election fair and square and goes about copying Hungary, to go back to your question, and trying to concentrate power in their own hands. So we have one relatively unlikely positive scenario and two very likely negative scenarios. Just one more thing to go back to your question about the charismatic Democrats, whether it's small d or capital D. One very straightforward problem is that when I talk to senators or congressmen in the United States, when I talk to MPs in Europe to some extent, when I talk to many influential journalists, a sentence that comes up very often is, after they say perfectly reasonable things, is, of course, I would never say this publicly. Why can't you have charismatic people fighting for our values? Because they don't level with the public. And you can't have charisma while talking differently in front of a camera than you do over lunch.
So, well put. So I want to take one from the audience, and this will have to be our last question because we're down to seconds. And maybe, Moises, you want to take this. Two themes have emerged at the festival so far: toxic individuality and lack of empathy. If the populace embraces those attitudes, how can autocratic leaders fail?
Moises.
Underperformance and public frustration and antipathy for the government is not a monopoly of democracies. Around the world, we have seen these kinds of debates, exactly the same kinds of debates with different identities in the middle. And so the story here is one of tolerance and intolerance. And what we have seen is the deepening of discord and the deepening of, again, what I said before, denying others the right to have a voice. And that is here and is continuing.
We could have this conversation for the rest of the afternoon. And I'm very pleased that the three of them two of them are old friends, and Yasha's a new one. So I'm hoping we can continue this. Please join me in thanking Anne-Marie, Moises, and Yasha.